I'm an architect as well as an artist, and all my work is small-scale, domestic, but it is also modern, even minimalist in character, and that is the kind of architecture I like. This is the interior of the studio I designed for myself. So it's something of a mystery to me that I should spend 25 years of my life doing portraits. As an artist, I enjoy abstraction. When I paint landscapes, for instance, there is a degree of abstraction about them, and the passages I most enjoy are the more abstract ones. So, evidently, I enjoy abstraction, but I also enjoy representation. It seems to me that without representation, art becomes very limited. The heads that I'm going to show today are clearly representational, but they are also, for me, to a degree abstract. Abstraction can vary. It can be more or less, and it doesn't necessarily cancel out representation. Some of my favorite painters, like Nicolas de Stijl, combine abstraction and representation. Mies van der Rohe put an entire figure, Morning, by Georg Kolber, in the pool of his Barcelona pavilion, and I am drawn to the special relationship between architecture and sculpture of this period. In fact, purely abstract art tends to be primarily aesthetic, as Francis Bacon pointed out. For Bacon, portraiture was the highest form of art. And so with the bust form, it's partly abstract as well as being clearly representational. When I was doing David Attenborough, he said towards the end, when it was just his head, "But you haven't given me any shoulders." And it is true that only by adding his shoulders and at an angle with his head could I give some expression to my idea of him of an incredibly articulate and mobile individual. This was a head I did at art school at Corsham. I found it on my mother's dust heap, rescued it, cleaned it up, and placed it on my mantelpiece. Soon after, the Creers came to dinner, and the minute Leo came into the room, he marched up to the mantelpiece, where I had placed the head, and said, "Who did this?" I owned up, and he immediately said, "You must do one of me." That was what started the long accident. But why did it turn out the way it did? Well, there were certain ideas in the air at this time. There was the idea that abstraction had become too introverted and elitist, incomprehensible to ordinary people. Creer appreciated Le Corbusier and modernism, but he was very keen on the sort of German neoclassicism that came into fashion around 1830, with people like Schinkel, Schadow, and Thorvaldsen. There was something fascinating about the way Schinkel revived ancient forms, and then they turned out to be modern. That is, they became to represent his moment in time very clearly. With all these conversations going on around me, I thought the head of Leon might somehow be an analogy for his ideas. I began to think about the bust shape itself. What did it imply? It seemed that the bust shape stood for the public face of the sitter, whereas the details of the face were concerned with the particularity of the person. Portraiture called for a likeness, but not an absolute likeness. It certainly didn't work with the death mask. There had to be sufficient resemblance. I was intrigued by the idea that in ancient Greece the individual was not so important as his social role as citizen. I became interested in the herm, that form which was both real and abstract, an abstract monument incorporating a figure. When I went to Rome, I spent hours in the Capitoline Museum looking at Roman heads, which were obviously intended to be realistic. But once the sitter was dead and gone, nobody could judge that aspect. Yet you still felt that some were good heads. The head of Medusa became a powerful image. By doing something that was deliberately stylized, I could perhaps represent Crere's ideas rather than just his appearance. As an object, I think the bust is quite powerful. That in itself was a discovery. The realization that whatever the surface ideas were, there was another level where it either worked or it didn't. This picture shows me modelling Leon under the scrutiny of Kenneth Frampton. So, by working on the bust of Leon Creer, I was forced to consider some of the problems of doing portraiture, and the project began to interest me. It so happened that in my circle of friends, there were a few who didn't mind being immortalized. First, I approached Edward Jones, a friend who was interested in the project and whose work I admired. He was undeniably handsome and even somewhat beautiful. So I was puzzled as to how to deal with this. Then I thought of Balzac's ideas of type and began to search in a different way. Finally, I thought of Mick Jagger, whose face is both frenzied and attractive. Suddenly, Edward's face slotted into place. It would be both beautiful and strong, and that's how it came out. The shape of the bust, which had started out more or less square like Leon's, now became curved and undercut, and the whole head looked right. By turning his head, it was possible to suggest a certain animation, a degree of life. Next, I chose John Miller. He had the look of an experienced architect, someone who'd been through a lot of tribulation. His work is modernist, but with a certain general quality that allows it to work with the old. His work at the National Gallery of Scotland shows this quality. So he came out looking like an antique head, with a square torso like Leon's. This bust makes a kind of history that is quite false, since John in the flesh isn't at all antiquarian. Yet though it's a fiction, it does make him larger than life. It gives him a different presence that doesn't seem altogether wrong. Alan Cahoon I thought about as a critic. He had written an interesting essay about typology. I'm afraid he's not here tonight because he's not well. And this made him part of the argument. It related him to the Creer interest in classical, romantic, and modern. By now I'd developed something of a way of working. I'd begun to realize that drawings were as useful as photographs, if not more so. Again, I took measurements of his head with calipers, and this time recorded them on drawings. With Cahoon, it is the intensity of the intellectual that comes through. So it wasn't difficult to find in him the form of a Roman senator, someone like Seneca who appreciated the power of argument, but was also reconciled to the futility of words. That gave him a tragic look. You can say that I was making up a fantasy about him, yet it was also a way of analyzing his character by means of stereotypes, and who can say that I got him wrong? When my husband became Dean of the School of Architecture at Princeton, for the next 10 years or so, things were complicated by frequent trips across the Atlantic. Up until now, I had known the sitters quite well. With some ambivalence, I took on Michael Graves, who is the well-known name, teaching at Princeton School. Michael Graves designed this fireplace for Charles Jenks' London house. Charles' idea was for me to make the bust of Vulcan, the god of iron and fire, who was to be personified by Edoardo Paolozzi. During the sittings, Edoardo explained to me why what I was doing was quite impossible for a modern artist in this day and age. You can't do whole figures today. Everything has to be fragmented, because we're living in a fragmented world. But I felt that the bust, being a fragment of the body, as well as incorporating its own support, could be both a traditional form and a modern object. There was also the challenge of his exceptional physique, which soon had me thinking about the Incredible Hulk as type, partly because Eduardo had been interested in comics in the days when he first came to London with the Smithsons. On the right is the mould, which is a negative space, although if you look closely it becomes positive. By now I'd got used to the idea of making drawings, and they'd become just as important as taking photographs. And this is a detail of the bronze cast I took before turning it into Vulcan, which was... In London that summer I asked James Sterling if he would sit for me. I thought of him as a sort of German baron or bishop, someone who combined power with gentleness. The front edge of the bust is lightened with a curved lip, which came from the massive curved cornice he employed in the State Gallery at Stuttgart. This is his bust in Belsize Park, in his house. The lithographs are by Edoardo Paolozzi. And this is a detail of the head. All the time he was sitting, we were listening to tapes of Mozart operas. When these were finished, he brought his own tapes of Verdi. Back in Princeton, having done Michael Graves, it wasn't long before it was Peter Eisenman's turn. At this time, I was glad for him to sit, as I wanted to try working on an anti-classicist, someone who had moved towards decentering and deconstruction. I thought of him as quite a Machiavellian character, sometimes full of gravity, sometimes behaving like a joker, something of a wild card. Also, he is wearing the collarless shirt of a priest, along with the braces of a journalist. Following his tough character, as well as his name, which means Iron Man, it is cast in iron, not bronze. That's my mobile phone ringing. That must be Peter Eisenman. Definitely. By now I realized that I'd only done busts of men, so I thought it time to consider doing a woman. There was one obvious candidate, our friend Françoise Choet, an urban historian interested in modern architecture. She's a scholar of both medieval and modern times. The problem was how to convey this perspective when she was also a chic Parisian and her hairstyle conveyed contemporary sophistication. I started by leaving out the hair entirely. I was looking for something basic in the face structure, and her high cheekbones suggested something Egyptian, the strength of women in a matriarchal society. On the left is a plaster cast of the last version of her bust in my studio. That's Peter Eisenman again. It was James Sterling who was keen for me to do a head of Richard Meyer, the cousin of Peter Eisenman. They're rivals. Obviously rivals for my mobile phone. I think he may have even persuaded Richard to sit. I was interested in doing his head, as he was a high modernist, and this might give me new problems of portrayal. As he is a modernist, I depicted him wearing an open-necked shirt, as if ready for tennis. His hairstyle lent itself more to a more romantic interpretation of the architect genius. I was still thinking about the general problem for me, which lay in the fact that most of the heads I had done were of men. So I conceived the idea of doing my friend Rita. Rita Wolf is a painter of visionary architecture, imaginary landscapes and dreams. Her paintings sometimes have the quality of Italian primitives. She agreed to sit, but did not want her head cast in bronze. I was thinking about Canova, who uses white marbles so freely it is almost like plaster. Plaster is not generally considered a suitable material for finished pieces because of its fragility. But Edoardo Palozzi, taking his clue from Rodin, has exhibited plaster pieces. I decided to make it in plaster. Raw plaster is bright white and can kill form, so I wanted to colour the plaster. So I applied thin washes of watercolour to the damp plaster. The head took several years to complete, as Rita was in London and I was based in America. I carried the plaster across the Atlantic in my luggage twice so that I could complete it, finding myself alternating between carving the plaster and modelling it. Later, I've sometimes used this technique in clay. Back in the United States, and still thinking about women sitters, I thought of doing a self-portrait. Why not? My own head was endlessly available. There was no problem with sittings. I did a bust in plaster, and later I painted it, as I had done Rita's. It is quite intimidating to turn your method on yourself when you are normally trying to see behind the surface and to enter the psychological level. An element of self-analysis is unavoidable. I didn't get it cast in bronze, so it has a more immediate quality, whereas bronze tends to put you at a distance. In 1991, John Nichols invited me to make a show of the heads in his gallery in Grand Street, Soho, in New York. The immediate problem would be how to display the work. When I began to think about the task, new possibilities came to light. The bust form had been thought of as a way of complementing the characters of the heads. If I put each one on a pedestal, the pedestals could be related in some similar way. The face, the bust, the pedestal could all work together at different degrees of abstraction. So I designed a set of bases, each one slightly different and related in some way to the head it supported. Many of the heads were quite classical, and as I don't consider myself a classicist, this was a problem for me. So the exhibition would have to counter the theme of classicism in some way. This is what led to me arranging them on a grid, free of hierarchy, and 3 rows of 4 fitted the space. The last one on the right is my own head, mounted not on a pedestal, but on the stand I used for making it. This gave an impression of incompleteness. The title I gave to this show was Figure Heads. Then there came an invitation from the Friends of Mies van der Rohe in Aachen to provide a head of him to stand in the entrance hall of a school named after him. Since I was living in Princeton at the time, I called up Eduardo and he persuaded Chris and Gabby Nash to lend me studio space in their foundry in Putney. In Aachen, the bust, which was just over life size, was mounted on a base made in steel in a form similar to one of his typical cruciform columns in the Berlin Museum. The base and installation were designed by Marlies Hentrup, and the bust was unveiled by Mies's daughter, Gilga. Then I was approached to do a head of T.S. Eliot, another dead subject, to go in the British Library. Eliot's widow, Valerie, was around. She invited me to her flat and showed me the photographs which she felt were most like him. These photographs made the project feasible. His appearance was remarkably consistent throughout his adult life, always the carefully combed hair, the 3-piece suit and tie. So it was with some trepidation that I started on it. Valerie would have to approve it. I tried the modern form of an isolated head on a cube, but found that something of the bust form had to be brought back to counter the balance, the way I had modelled him leaning forward. But I had to accept the concession. of giving him a collar and tie. Before long, Sandy Wilson asked me to do a head of him. He came regularly for sittings at Mall Studios. I drew and measured, took photographs, but the photographs never looked like him. At rest, his face looked glum and gave quite a different impression from when it was animated by talking, when it appeared quite boyish. I felt that as a modernist, his head should take a modern form. I tried the head on its own and had it directly mounted on a block of slate. I was not satisfied. Sandy frequently wore a red scarf. This is what led to the idea of using his scarf to form the base. The garment on its own, no body. Sandy proved a good patron. When I suggested that I should do a head of his wife, he agreed. M.J. Long had been my teacher at architecture school and is currently professor at Yale. For her, I reverted to the bust form, but in a modest way that you're hardly aware of. At the back of my mind were the Egyptians again. I knew that when working in stone, they carved from each of the four sides of the block. Frontality seemed important. MJ is a very straight person, so I did her straight on, no frills. I thought the full-on pose would represent her strong and direct character. I did give a lot of thought to the patina, and the bronze patina is near to the natural colour of bronze, dark brown with a touch of gold. I felt this appropriate to her modernist approach to architecture. Terry Farrell was the architect for the refurbishment of the Dean Centre in Scotland, which was to house a lot of Paolozzi's work. Sue Farrell approached me and asked me to do a bust of Terry to be put in the entrance hall. By now the classical model didn't seem so relevant. I'd lost my inhibitions about trying to make a likeness and was thinking more of Rodin. Although his style of architecture is somewhat eclectic, he has a formidable reputation as an architect-planner, Terry. Besides which, I thought he had an interesting head, so I just enjoyed myself with him. He's an expansive character, so I gave him plenty of body, and I had no qualms about leaving the edges of the bust rough and uneven. Up until now, the majority of the heads I'd done were of architects. The next proposal came from a friend who wanted a bust of her husband to give him as a present. As he was an old friend, I agreed. Sir Richard Godwin Austen, an eminent neurological surgeon, became the first to sit for me in my new studio. The great benefit was he was not an architect, and this was some relief. I began to feel a curiosity about his psyche and tried to portray it. So there is a man within a man in some sense. For some time, it stood in the hall of their Georgian house, which provided a fine setting for it. My interest in Eric Parry was partly that he knew my friends and partly that I admired his theoretical interests. I thought he had an interesting, rather romantic head. There is a fascination about a character who looks poetic, even though he makes his living doing buildings, which from my own experience I know to be a very restrictive field. How could he work in this way and still look interesting? Maybe restrictions may work to increase the depth of thought. This was something I was trying to do myself. His architecture is not wild, it comes from within the limits of public acceptance, so he must have thought about these aspects himself. I was beginning to wonder whether my ideas about public sculpture only worked for a small world of architectural cognoscenti. Maybe the references to what I had thought was a public language only worked for those in the know. Now I was approached by Clare College to do a likeness of an eminent alumnus of the college, David Attenborough. As an ardent viewer of his programs, I could not refuse. I bought a cine camera to see if it would help me use the media upon which he so frequently appears. It did not help. Gestures on films don't translate well into sculpture. A smile can so easily turn into a fatuous grin. So in order to express his vigour and enthusiasm, as displayed on the screen, I simply turned his head so that from his proposed position on the college staircase, he is looking directly towards you. Working on a three-dimensional solid likeness, which is what a sculptor does, is different from what a photographer or painter is doing. Painters may be trying to portray a moment in time. I'm usually trying to make a likeness that is a summary of moments over time. I find that now I'm using the sittings more and more to observe and to absorb, working on the clay later from my recordings and from memory. So that's how it came about. It's a matter of speculation whether my working as an architect, which puts terrible restrictions on one's self-expression, is what has given me the patience to work in such detail. Being true to the appearance of the sitter is a bit like being true to the function, but it's not the whole story. So, my thanks are due to Duncan McCorkadale for putting me up for doing the book, to Nadine Murnham, his editor, for her constant help, to Julia Morlock for her excellent design, and I must thank also Alan Cahoon for his marvellous essay.
Good evening. Celia has asked me to say a few words. My name is Edward Jones, and you may recognize a more idealized version of me 25 years ago. But I was her second sitter. I don't know quite what that means, but I wasn't her first. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you to Brett Steele and the AA for allowing this figurative to cross the threshold of the AA. And in the form of Celia's wonderful lecture and her book launch, which will follow it. And possibly Celia will be responsible for a revival of the romantic in this institution. I've always thought these rooms had a conspiratorial nature. Sort of dark and interesting things have often happened here, in my experience. And secondly, to say what a magnificent book Celia has produced. I hope you'll all buy one. This is more than a book. It's a kind of document reflecting an era, magnificent in its layout, its wit, and its anecdotal detail, visual detail that she's incorporated in it. And I particularly like the photograph, Bob's photograph of a sceptical Kenneth Frampton, modernist Kenneth Frampton, observing a Leon Creer sitting with some sort of concern, you might say. I think people sitting next to me were saying that he had the look of the boss about him. I'll stop on that thought. It's always reassuring to find yourself favourably compared to a once rebellious icon, Mick Jagger. I mean, I never knew Celia was going to pull that one. Alan Cahoon, in his thoughtful essay, reminds us that in her work there are other agendas than the idealization of the body. There's a lot of mileage, as it were, still in this topic. And this is further developed in Celia's running text in the book, running notes over 25 years, in which we are, I think, privileged to hear her observations and concerns and dilemmas in the work that she's been involved in. I think this is a very special ingredient in the book. I don't know any book that's done it so candidly from a working artist. Most importantly, the book is a celebration of her marvelous sculpture that is fully aware of its lineage, is fully aware of the past, and somehow not inhibited by it, and has something new to say about the human subject. And I think her words have supported that. And her portraiture has been recognized internationally in America, in Germany, and in Scotland. But it's a major omission, I feel, that the National Portrait Gallery in London, that we've both had some involvement with, has not commissioned her. It got very close with the bust of Jim Sterling, but we're told that trustees vetoed it and thought it wasn't modern enough. It is now in Edinburgh as part of the endowment of Sterling's work and objects and wonderful Thomas Hope chairs and Celia's bust. Finally, I feel I should make a comment on why certain of Celia's architectural friends sat for her in the decade 1881 to 1891 in Mull Studios. Some might say that they represented a certain sort of clique, and maybe that's partly true. No high-tech types there. Few academicians, I think. But a series of overlapping relationships between people and places. London, Liverpool, Cornell, Royal College of Art, Princeton, etc., with somehow Colin Rowe implicated in it all. And interestingly, Celia didn't show this tiny, rather fauve-like sculpture she did of Colin. I think it was on one of the shelves in the studio. The conversations centered on type forms, Cahoon, this is 1982, the recovery of history, Rowe and Creer, the modern architecture and the traditional city. I should repeat that, the almost profane thought that modern architecture and the traditional city might not be mutually exclusive, John Miller and Jim Sterling. So when I sat for Celia in 1982, Schinkel had been somehow rediscovered. He seemed to be everywhere. There were competitions set for a villa for Schinkel, I think by Sterling. There was an archives for Schinkel in the Charlottenhof Gardens in Berlin. He was everywhere. And he was an inspiration, I think, for some of Celia's work in those 1982 days. And it revived this idea of the architecturally embedded sculpture. And she also refers to Mies about that. Celia on Schinkel, and I quote her, "There was something fascinating about the way Schinkel revived ancient forms, and then they turned out to be modern. That is, they came to represent his moment in time very clearly. There was at once, they were at once classical, romantic, and modern. There was a buzz of excitement when you thought of history as a succession of present moments, and not as completely dusty past." And so, as one of Celia's friends who, as she has said, didn't mind being immortalized in bronze, I propose a toast to her, to Celia, who never sought the limelight, Celia who has privately cultivated her own garden, and Celia who has always given staunch support to Bob, who this book is dedicated to, and who, this evening, has dazzled us all with her remarkable talents. Celia.
should be some refreshment at the back of the room now. If it isn't there,